Third phase of moon.
Third phase moon, Blake Cousins here. A special report. Dr. J. Andy Elias speaks with Andrew D. Basaggio. He's a lawyer, a writer, and a 21st century visionary, also time traveler. What you're about to see is quite controversial. Let me tell you, what Andrew claims is extraordinary. Is it the truth? He claims he worked with DARPA, time travel. Listen to this incredible experience. Dr. J. Andy Elias, live right now.
With that being said, let's go ahead and introduce today our very special guest, the one and only Mr. Andrew Basaggio. Andrew, you with us?
Yes, I am, Dr. J. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. It's been quite some time that we've been meaning to do this, and I'm finally glad we're able to do it. And for all those who don't know you, I think the first time the word chrononaut was coined was regarding you. Am I right?
Well, I popularized it, I guess, in the same way that Buckminster Fuller didn't originate, but popularized the word geodesic dome. Chrononaut, as far as we're able to tell, emerged in a 1962 American science fiction novel. But it was science fact when we began time traveling in the late 1960s. And it's a term that I'm seeking to popularize primarily because I believe that the cadre of chrononauts that emerged in the late 60s and early 70s deserve the same status as the astronauts. And by the way, they did not just include Americans. There were also, for example, British and Russian chrononauts.
And now, let's go back to the Project Pegasus, because when do you think the first time travel experiments began? Was it Philadelphia experiment? Was it before that? How does Montauk fit into all this? I mean, I want you to explain it to everybody out there listening as if they've never heard this information before. So essentially, let me go back to that initial question. When did time travel for humans begin?
In antiquity, we know that because we know that when DARPA established Project Pegasus in the mid to late 1960s, they created an intelligence funnel in which they put, for example, the experimentation by the Sumerian, Babylonian, and Egyptian civilizations in time travel, as well as foreign technology from the Nazi German and the Soviet Russian experimentation, as well as reverse engineered extraterrestrial technology. So for as long as we've been visited by extraterrestrials, which goes back thousands of years to antiquity, maybe even to the propagation of life on Earth, time travel has existed somewhere in the cosmos because it was utilized, it has been utilized for extraterrestrials to reach our planet across the vast reaches of space and time, namely time-space. In the modern era, I would say sort of in the post-industrial revolution Earth civilization that we're living in, I think we can identify a significant point in terms of Nikola Tesla's stay in Colorado Springs, Colorado in 1899, because we know that he was beginning to experiment with vortal teleportation during that famous stay in Colorado Springs. And we know also that my late father, Raymond F. Basaggio, repeated those teleportation experiments at the Thomas A. Edison Research Laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey, where my father worked between 1956 and 64. So there were precursors. Now, you mentioned a very important chapter in time travel history, which is the so-called Philadelphia experiment. After Nikola Tesla's death on January 7th of 1943, later in 1943, there was a time travel experiment that was undertaken utilizing Tesla's teleportation technology. But the Philadelphia experiment story that has come down to us is the cover story that was scripted by the Office of Naval Intelligence. So, for example, it wasn't an experiment into radar invisibility involving the Eldridge, as the classic storyline and the one that was recapitulated in the movie and so forth in 1984 told. It was, in fact, an experiment involving utilizing Tesla teleportation to move a ship called the Martha's Vineyard away from, in light of the fact that the Nazi Navy was beginning to chain ordnance to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So in other words, it was the direct application of Tesla teleportation technology. And all of the other major facts that have come down to us in what I call the Philadelphia experiment cover story were alterations of the original facts to conceal the critical linkage between Tesla, teleportation, and the Los Alamos physicists, and by that I mean the Manhattan Project physicists, who during and after the war were publicly touting their advances in building more destructive atomic bombs, but concealing the time travel research that they were undertaking at the same time. So there was a Philadelphia experiment, but all of the facts were changed. The ship didn't go back to Norfolk, Virginia. It went back to Newport News. The experiment wasn't undertaken in Philadelphia Naval Yard. It was undertaken in Long Island Sound. The individuals who have variously been identified as being involved in the experiment, Tesla, John von Neumann, Albert Einstein, were not at the helm of the Eldridge, but in fact two Manhattan Project physicists, J. Robert Oppenheimer and Edward Teller, were at the helm of the Martha's Vineyard. And there we have the effort that was made to conceal that fact, to conceal the fact that after Tesla's death, his paperwork was seized by two War Department officials who forwarded his documents, his schematics, his formulae onto the National Archives under the Alien Property Act, and then sent them to the most logical place on the planet to send them, which is where the world's leading physicists and electrical engineers were then gathering in Los Alamos, New Mexico, to build the atomic bomb. And that's where Tesla's paperwork is today. The papers of Tesla were never lost. They are still located at Los Alamos, and that essentially is the hidden history of the Philadelphia experiment, and indeed the larger history of the U.S. development of time travel, which is to say that time travel was the secret twin of the Manhattan Project, and it was undertaken by the Los Alamos physicists.
I'm glad you talked about the Tesla papers. I got a few comments to make on what you said. That first of all, you're right. They were never missing out. People, I think his niece said that the moment right after he passed away, federal agents went to his hotel room and literally took away all his notes. So I wouldn't be surprised that they're sitting with, some government scientists somewhere or military scientists. Another very interesting, you said, the way extraterrestrials travel is via time travel. And that's going back to what Dr. J. Allen Hynek said, where essentially they're skipping dimensions. And Bob Lazar always states that if we can alter gravity, things such as time travel to force fields to teleportation, wormholes, all become a reality. And this is my next question. I've heard a rumor, or from other people who've spoken about this, I don't know if you want to call it a rumor, it's just a suggestion, that we can only go back as far as the first time a time machine was brought here or used here. Do you know if there's any merit to that question, to that statement?
But that's kind of an elision on a practical constraint rather than a sort of a metaphysical certitude. And by that I mean some forms of time travel open up a vortal tunnel in time-space, for example, Tesla teleportation, through which the teleportee is physically passing. After the advent of Tesla teleportation, were we to teleport somebody, sort of shoot them across the quantum bow and teleport them to a time before the advent of such devices, there was the practical constraint, there was the practical constraint of getting them home to the present, of getting them back from the past. But it doesn't relate in any larger metaphysical way, in almost as if magic, in terms of the fact that there's some cosmic threshold that exists that you can't cross because the machines weren't in existence. It was just simply the practical problem of somebody being stranded in the past without the device to get home. It's not a sort of a cosmic certitude that there's a threshold that when you cross it, you can't time travel to before the invention of the device. That indeed is the problem with some of the devices, is you can't time travel before their development because you will strand the time traveler. That's why we developed, in addition to teleportation, the chronovisors of Ernetti and Gemelli into a holographic way of embedding somebody in a past event, so that when the hologram was collapsed, they found themselves back in the present. That's why Dr. Sterling Colgate, who just passed away in 2013, developed plasma confinement chambers to use radioactive plasma to embed the time traveler in a past event. And then when that localized quantum field effect wore off, the time traveler was spontaneously returned to the present. So it was really very much a practical necessity of stranding the time traveler in the past as a result of not having the device to get home, not some kind of cosmic threshold that resulted from the time that the technology was developed.
You mentioned your father was involved, or he said something about, was it the Tesla papers or about the Philadelphia experiment? What was his involvement with the military, the government, or any of these people associated with these projects that essentially led you into the project which you participated in, which was Project Pegasus?
Yeah, my dad was brought into the U.S. defense community's response to the extraterrestrial presence several months after the famous July 1952 overflight of Washington, D.C., by 9 extraterrestrial craft that were clocked on radar at Langley Air Force Base as traveling at 7,000 miles per hour, which was far beyond our flight capability at that time. Specifically, he was approached at his job at the Okanite Company in Paramus, New Jersey, to report the next Monday, this was in October of 1952, to work on the ramjet and other high-performance jet engines and jet aircraft. On the ramjet project, my father designed the metal alloy by which the ramjet was built, so that when it would be traveling at supersonic speeds in our atmosphere, it wouldn't melt from he found an alloy that worked, and so that we would be able to build the ramjet engines. So that brought him into the classified defense-related research realm, where our response to the performance criteria that we saw above Washington, D.C. in July of 1952 involved. And that was an extraterrestrial presence that, for example, could not only travel at very fast speeds, but be seen at one location in the sky above the Capitol and then blink off and suddenly appear elsewhere above Washington, D.C. In other words, those craft were seen to be teleporting. They were seen to be time traveling above our nation's capital. During the 1956 to 64 period, following on that event and his involvement in classified defense work, my father was asked by the U.S. government to repeat Nikola Tesla's experimentation with teleportation from 1899 and onward until his death in 43, during those years at the Edison Labs. And then by the mid-1960s, when there was a push to create this intelligence funnel into which everything that would yield a time travel capability would be placed, that intelligence funnel becoming DARPA's Project Pegasus, certainly by 1967-68, my father at that point was one of the country's leading experts on the theory and practice of one of the technologies, Tesla teleportation. And so by the time I was brought in informally into Project Pegasus in winter of 1968, when I first teleported between New Jersey and New Mexico and back with my late father, and then when I was brought in officially as a child participant in the fall of 1969, which was the beginning of my 3rd grade year, my father's role was essentially as the chief technical consultant between the Ralph M. Parsons Company, the prominent engineering firm, and the CIA on the theory and practice of teleportation.
Obviously, he felt safe enough to send his son through this process to teleport through time. Otherwise, he wouldn't have chosen you as this test subject, right?
Very much so. My dad was not placing my life at any greater risk. He was probably placing it at lesser risk than I would have experienced flying in a commercial airliner or taking an automobile from point A to point B. I was brought in at a time where several years had passed, and Navy enlisted personnel had already been utilized to test the capability of teleportation, as well as a cadre of disadvantaged kids from Latin America, where our government was negotiating with the corrupt, authoritarian, right-wing regimes of Latin American countries, and they made this Faustian Deal where they would bring, basically street urchins off the streets of major capitals in Latin America, and if the kids survived the classified defense development testing that they were subjected to, they would be given, the Faustian Deal was that they would be given everything that they might not get if they stayed in their home countries. A roof over their head, parents, an education, enough food to eat, enough clothing to wear, and so forth. I was brought in the third cadre of teleportees, and we were basically bright, sturdy, healthy children from stable, intact, church-going families. Now, why was that? That was because one of the programmatic objectives was to test the mental and physical effects of Tesla teleportation on the kind of American children that the children in the first families of the country would be, namely the children of the president, the vice president, the secretary of state, our top military officials, and so on. Because they were anticipating that once they worked out all of the bugs and they had completely reduced Tesla teleportation to a safe form of virtually instantaneous travel, we would be using it, for example, to shuttle the president around U.S. military bases, between U.S. military bases around the world, if, for example, he had to make a state visit in a certain country. Or let's say the Secretary of State had a summit to attend, and we wanted to get our number 3 official there, executive branch official there, without any jet lag. Okay, so they wanted to test, well, what is this going to do to the kids of the president, the vice president, the Secretary of State? So I was a lucky kid. I had loving, responsible parents. I was growing up in a garden suburb of New Jersey at a time when I think New Jersey had the second leading public school system in the country after Connecticut. I was the youngest in a family of 7. I was bright. I was physically fit, although not an athlete. I was healthy. And so one of the things they wanted to do is they would test our medical condition and also give us about 2.5 hours of math and verbal problems when we began regularly teleporting between New Jersey and New Mexico in the summer of 1970 when I was 8. So in a sense, I don't like to use the term guinea pigs because they already knew the technology was safe. We were experimentees on one level because they wanted to develop a baseline. Okay, what will this technology do to a healthy kid from a fortunate background? There were other reasons, of course, why they used children. They needed children in the chronovisors because when they used an adult, the holograms would collapse from the heartbeat, the respiration, the footfall, or an errant cough or sneeze by an adult chronovisee. They knew when we were time traveling that the perceptions of children are more keen. They're more keen than those of adults because children's perceptions are not miscolored by the selection bias of their existing experiences. They use the example of sending an adult, let's say 200 years in the future. If they saw a holster on somebody's belt, the adults would say, well, I saw somebody carrying a firearm in a holster on their belt. But if they sent a child to the same location 200 years in the future, the child would see what was actually there and would say, I saw an adult, in the year 2200 carrying some kind of scientific implement in a holster, like the holsters we would use to carry a pistol. So we were deemed to be more reliable observers of what we would be observing in the past and future. And also, quite clearly, we were trainees because they were planning on sending us to the Naval Academy in Annapolis after high school graduation and utilizing our time at the Naval Academy as a pretext, as Donald Rumsfeld said when I was on the project to my father in one conversation, and will use their time at the Naval Academy as a pretext to involve in an additional project activity. So we were, in a sense, time-space cadets that they were educating in the theory and practice of different forms of time travel, because we would be doing a lot of it in adulthood after becoming naval officers.
I'm going to ask you two questions. First of all, how many children were involved in Project Pegasus, and what's the furthest they went back, and the latest in the future they went to? Both, I guess. The latest and the furthest. Yeah.
I got this wrong recently at Cable Access in the very city where I practiced law for 20 years, which is Vancouver, Washington. So let me correct this. Overall, I was told, but when I was on the project and then years later, by an individual by the name of Courtney M. Hunt of the CIA, who was briefing me about different aspects of intelligence community activity from roughly 1981 to 2001. His facts corresponded with what I was told when I was on the project, that there were 140 American school children.
Days of moon. Third days